You have that special someone in your life who's quite good at starting a job, but not very good at finishing it properly. You know, they mow the lawn and leave the extension cable out and all the doors to the shed unlocked. Or they cook a dinner and the kitchen's an absolute bomb site. Or they put a wash on but never seem to take it out of the washing machine. Or they promise to tidy their bedroom and frankly it still looks like you can't see the carpet. Well, when it comes to finishing a project for which you want to get paid, then that point, it's really important that both parties can decide when it actually is, that we have some sort of measures. About 100 years ago in the UK, construction contracts were known as an entire agreement, which meant that actually the whole of the scope of the works had to be finished before the contractor could get paid. Now, the problem was you needed a few grumpy pants who said, you haven't finished this handle, or oh, I expected a window, or whatever, to not get paid for any of the rest of the works. So the idea of something called substantial or practical completion came into being. And that means we're not looking for perfection. We're not looking for it to be pristine. There may be minor work still to be done, like hairline cracks in the plaster to be filled, or a door handle to be replaced because it's come loose. There are a few things that are defective that we need to be fixed. But frankly, if the works listed in the specification have been done and the client can use the project as intended, then that's called completion. The difficulty is we don't really define completion in our contracts. So we've had bridges that have wobbled when school children went across them. That was 18 months of repairs to make sure the bridge didn't wobble anymore. We've had huge skyscrapers with bolts falling off, bolts the size of your arm. Well, that needed all the bolts checking because they were lethal. We've had wind turbines sinking slowly into the Solway Firth. And I may be no expert, but I reckon a submerged wind turbine is nowhere near as effective as producing power as one that's above the water. So we have a pinch point, a point at which the contractor is no longer responsible for finishing everything, to be on site, to be present, but are just doing some tidying up works. And that is a point called practical completion. Now, the cases have tried to define practical completion, and there's a quote which says, well, practical completion is like an elephant. We know what it is when we see it, but it's hard to define. Well, this is an elephant. This is an elephant. They're both very different. Maybe they are hard to define, but they've got some fairly fundamental features. I reckon I'd be better off at being able to define an elephant than I am at trying to define practical completion. But there have been cases where parties have tried to define in advance what practical completion means. The problem is they haven't argued over whether or not it's complete. They've argued over what the definition meant. Not really very helpful. So the one person on a project who gets to decide is the contract administrator. Now you can make completion at their discretion, or you can try and control it, or you can have completion being at their discretion, but payment being dependent on various other things. Now, for anyone who works in the rail industry, you might be aware that there are very clear regulations as what needs to be provided before trains can run over tracks for the health and safety of all the passengers. But I was looking at a summary of what was required for completion in a rail contract recently, and it was longer than a page of A4 text. There was a lot of repetition, so I imagine in different parts of the contract, different things had been included. There was completion of the works, as you'd expect, being able to use as intended, as you'd expect, passing of tests, as you'd expect. There was documentation that they needed in order to get the permission to use the rail, as you'd expect. And then there was a whole host of other things all coming together at completion. So completion is fact dependent, opinion dependent, document dependent. It may be subjective, entirely at someone's discretion, or it could be objective, based on tests. Now, engineering contracts tend to work on a test basis. The wobbly bridge would never have passed completion under an engineering contract because it would have had to prove that it would work when people walked across it. And it didn't wobble and make them go green at the girls and slightly poorly. So practical completion is a real pinch point in contracts. It doesn't mean absolute completion. It can include a project that's complete with serious irremediable defects, as you'll read in the blog post referred to in my newsletter. But completion doesn't have to mean perfection. There's very few projects that need perfection before they can be called complete. Operating theatres, food factories, they need a higher level of completion than, say, an office building or even a house. And I know we often hear homeowners grumbling about things that are missing in their houses. And to be honest, when the list is 20 pages long, they've probably got a point that the house was not complete when it was handed over to them. But there are always going to be minor issues, minor items outstanding, and the occasional crack or defect that needs to be repaired. That doesn't mean you can prevent the contractor from getting a certificate of completion. You don't have to be right if you're issuing a certificate. You have to be reasonable. And if other people would say, that's complete, then it is. So practical completion means not absolute perfection, because we'd never get anything done. It means not huge things missing, like roofs or windows or doors. But it does mean that there will still be a few little niggly bits to be dealt with in the defects period. And that's the purpose of the defects period, to sort it out. Now, if you want functional completion based on actual meeting a particular requirement, then you need to have an engineering type contract with the testing, remedies and defects periods that an engineering type contract has. If you want construction, well, it's fairly subjective. It's the wobbly bridge. As long as it reaches from both sides of the River Thames, from bank to bank, then it's complete. So have a think. What should completion mean for your projects? What does it look like? What do you need to happen before you can allow completion to take place? What would you like to happen? What documents do you need? What tests should be passed? Whatever you need to be able to use that project, write it into your contract. But don't make it too complicated, because the more complicated you make it, the more there will be arguments about what it means. Have a think. Which of the projects have you completed? Were they really practically complete when certified?